Welcome, I'm Barbara Marcum, and I'm the Director of Senior Resources for the City of Westland. With me today is Roger Bushnell and Gabrielle Schropp. Gabrielle is a social worker over at the Village of Westland. Why don't we start with Roger? You can give us a little bit about background. We're going to be covering Alzheimer's disease today. So Roger, why don't you start?
All right. Well, Alzheimer's and dementia came knocking at my door about 19, 20 years ago. Both of my parents had different forms of dementia. My father was officially diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and I do believe he also had symptoms of dementia with Lewy bodies as well. And I believe because of the stress of caregiving for my dad, my mother started having mini strokes, which led to vascular dementia. So this has been part of my life for a long time. It led to me changing careers. I became the executive director at the building where my parents lived, and I've been in this industry ever since. Been very involved with the Alzheimer's Association for about 17 years, including one of the board chairs, which I was honored to do. So this has been a part of, as we mentioned earlier on a side conversation, it's been part of my personal, professional, and community service life for a long time.
Great, great, thank you. Gabrielle, we'll call you Gabby.
Works for
That's
me.
what you go by. Okay, so Gabby, let's find out how you got to where you are today.
Well, I moved to the side of the state from a small farm on the other side of the state in college. I stayed after college. I've worked in a couple different places around Wayne County, Oakland, Macomb, and Washtenaw for the last 7 years. I have worked in senior living and senior care for about 3 years now of those 7 years.
Seniors are very special to me.
They are.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Alzheimer's. What is Alzheimer's disease?
So Alzheimer's is a form of dementia. Dementia you can think of as an umbrella with many different types underneath it. So there are different types such as Alzheimer's. Dementia itself is just known as memory loss, some sort of memory loss. So there's Alzheimer's, there's vascular dementia, there's Lewy body dementia, there is mixed form of dementia where you can have multiple, there's frontal temporal lobe dementia, and then there sometimes you'll see unspecified dementia as a diagnosis.
A lot of different. Mm-hmm. Okay, so who's affected by Alzheimer's?
Everyone. In fact, here in Michigan, we have 11.2% of the population over the age of 65 has some form of dementia developing. Either from mild cognitive all the way up to final stages of Alzheimer's or dementia. So everyone is affected. This disease, more than any other I can think of, really affects the entire family. Because the family is going through a lot too as they see the changes, and a lot of times it can be very difficult to handle, especially when your parent might stop forgetting who you are or understanding your relationship. So everyone is affected by this. Everyone I run into nowadays, somebody knows somebody that is dealing with this, either with a loved one or a loved one of their own.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Long ago, okay, people used to call, my mother said, we had an Aunt Kate, who was senile. Mm-hmm. And we used to pretend we were on a radio show and she thought she was winning all these prizes. And they used to call it senility at that time. Out of curiosity, do they believe that Alzheimer's was actually, one of the things that contributed to cognitive loss long time ago? They just didn't have a name for it. They didn't know what it was. They obviously didn't have the technology to see what it was. Mm-hmm. So do you think that long ago what they used to call senile was actually dementia or Alzheimer's?
Yeah, so in the 20th century with the technological boom and the medical advancements that we made, we now are able to recognize what Alzheimer's is, and we're able to see it and identify it. We Can't really say for 100% certain because there could be so many different factors.
You don't have brains left from there.
Right.
Okay, that's one thing.
But it is a good possibility that is. And there's a lot of different things that have been lost due to institutionalizations that we never got to study or we never had the chance because of the taboo in society.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely, that's correct. Okay, I think a lot of people are really terrified of memory loss, okay, because it has such an impact on people's lives. So I even asked some of my staff and I said, okay, if you could have anything else go wrong with you, if you lost limbs, you know what I mean, or whether or not you were blind, what would you rather have? Would you rather have dementia? Or would you rather have a physical, something that you couldn't do anymore? And they said definitely physical, because once you go through there, you don't know people, you can't think, you can't process information. No, I wouldn't want to have, that's the last thing that I want. So that goes to show you how devastating that really can be. Do you think that's one of the fears that people have when they start realizing they have some memory loss? They don't want to get diagnosed, they don't want to go.
Yep. Not only is it one of the fears, it's the top fear. According to the National Institute of Health, or Health Institute, sorry, for those surveyed over the age of 55 of the health condition they are most fearful of, 39% is Alzheimer's, and then the next behind it would be cancer at 30%.
Wow, those are some big statistics, aren't they?
Yeah.
Well, you know, for me, okay, so not being a biologist, my bachelor's degree is in gerontology, but I thought, okay, I want to present that so that people can understand what Alzheimer's is. And it's interesting for me because neurons are what are affected in Alzheimer's disease, and there are 3 parts: the dendrites, the nucleus, and the axon. They all have different jobs within the neuron, but what ends up happening is that the neuron can't, they send signals, electrical signals, chemical signals, and they tell the other, what they give information that way, and then they're affected, and then they no longer can communicate, they die, and this happens by lots and lots of them at one time. Okay, and that's why ultimately the brain has a massive inability to function. So ultimately, do you think that this is why people no longer can live independently, because as it progresses, they completely lose their ability to function even on the most basic level, getting dressed maybe, you know what I mean, cooking, reading a recipe, or driving somewhere?
Yep. So that's very true. And what we see a lot of times is families try their best as abilities and cognition decrease, try their best to make things work in the home environment. Sometimes that isn't the safest environment. We can handle a lot, and I say we as a former caregiver.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Caregiver here too.
And so we can handle a lot, but when it becomes, I feel, necessary to really look at a move is when somebody becomes what they say is a wandering risk or an elopement risk, where they're not aware of their surroundings, their home might not look like their home anymore, and they want to search that out. So with a lot of the declines, not only does it add frustration to the person with the disease, it adds stress to the caregiver. In fact, for those over the age of 60, 70% will have a health crisis before the person they're caring for because of the stress of the disease.
Caregiving is difficult. I mean, I am well aware of that. Is Alzheimer's always a fatal disease?
Well, if it continues, it is fatal. Think of it as the brain is the control center for everything. And as its functions start diminishing, I'll use my mom as an example because even though she was officially diagnosed with vascular, I would say she had mixed dementia at the end there. So as Alzheimer's and the vascular dementia progressed, her ability to even swallow, her mind to be able to tell her how to swallow diminished. And then finally, the ability to even breathe, because the brain basically controls everything we do. Okay. And so when the brain is becoming affected to where it can't control everything else, it does cause death. In fact, it's currently, for years it was the 6th leading cause of death. COVID has now placed that into the 7th place. Not exactly how we want to get there, but it is definitely the 6th leading cause of death for those over 60. Or I'm sorry, generally.
Okay, yeah, because there's a lot of dementias. Like, what do we think of Alzheimer's? Is that really the majority?
That's the dementia that has that's most common.
Oh, okay. All right. So, what percentage? Okay, then, if they're Alzheimer's, do we have any data as far as what percentage of dementias?
Yeah, so according to the Alzheimer's Association and their statistics that they publish every year, 60 to 80% of all dementias diagnosed are Alzheimer's.
Well, that's interesting. When we were talking about cognitive function, they said that often a decade before people actually show signs of cognitive decline, they have actually things going on in their brain at that point. So that's kind of a scary thing. I'm sure everybody who forgets where they put their keys is thinking, oh my gosh, you know what I mean? Is something happening there? When do people generally develop Alzheimer's?
So most people the diagnosis is over 65 for Alzheimer's and dementia. But as you said, the line or the lineage of the progression of the disease, the first step is that asymptomatic step. So it goes asymptomatic, mild cognitive due to Alzheimer's, mild dementia, moderate dementia, and severe dementia. And so going back, I forgot the question.
Oh, no. What are the first signs? It's like, are there stages that you go through?
So those are the different stages. And then there's something called early onset, which is any diagnosis before the age of 65. So it is possible to be diagnosed before 65.
And there are other dementias as well.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So it could be early onset, just means it's before the time that normally it appears.
Right.
So it could be 50.
Right.
You know what I mean? So, and that's frightening too when you think about that. Okay, so if it's caught early enough, is there medication?
There are 2 medications by the FDA currently that are approved in order to help in the early stages. I mean, as soon as you start having memory loss that affects your day-to-day, and a good example is sometimes we'll forget a doctor's appointment, but we'll remember, be like, oh shoot, I had a doctor's appointment at 1 today, and you'll notice later on. People, when it disrupts the day-to-day, they don't have that recall to where they don't remember that they had that appointment at all. And so things like that, those situations, those are the first steps to look at and to get checked out by your doctor.
Okay, is there a genetic link? Because if we say like 70% or whatever of Alzheimer's, is there a genetic link as a component to part of that?
There can be a genetic link. It's not as big as you think of, like some forms of cancer and things like that, especially breast cancer or prostate cancer. If you think of those things, you can say, hey, personally, my grandmother had colon cancer, and so I know when she was in her 30s, so I know when I'm in my 30s, I have to have a colonoscopy to check for that because of the genetic link. It's not as prevalent with Alzheimer's. It's only about 25%, but there is a specific gene with genetic testing that they do look for. The other things that influence it can be environmental factors, can be biological, and different factors that Roger will go more into.
Okay. Well,
that was smooth.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I will say that, yes, it's a small percentage that we can say is genetic. However, Most of us inherit our parents' eating habits. We inherit how much physical activity they do, and also education, because there is a component to that as well. So even though some of it is not genetic per se, environmental, yes, and we pick up some of the habits from our parents, good and bad, and so that can definitely greatly affect.
I'm just curious about something you just said.
Yeah.
Education.
Education, yep. And the reason for that, it's not that if you have a higher education that it's going to insulate you from it. What it will do is the appetite for continual learning helps stimulate the brain.
Yes.
And so that is a habit, like exercise or eating right. And so if you are in the habit of continual learning, you may actually have it, but you'll function at a higher level because of your commitment to ongoing learning.
And
That's
there are,
great.
Yeah, there are other biological risk factors as well, such as head injuries. So if you had a head injury during your lifetime, a TBI, which is a traumatic brain injury,
Right.
you can develop some sort of dementia, and as well as heart health. There's a big link between heart health and brain health because we have the most
Makes sense.
vascular system. The biggest vascular system is in our brain. Our
That's
brain
right.
is what
Yep.
takes up most of our blood, and so if our heart's not working right, our brain's not working right. So heart health is one of the biggest components to it.
Yay for all those physical activities we do at the Friendship Center. Okay, why do seniors hide their memory loss?
Well, I feel it's a survival instinct. None of us want to appear weak, and they don't want to lose what they consider as their independence. They feel that if family or friends start to see that there is a cognitive decline, that they might be uprooted and moved, and that they will not be able to feel as independent.
Yeah, control their own lives. I mean, once adult children can be very imposing.
Yep.
It's like, Mom, you can't do this anymore. You have to move, and when they don't want to move. But the thing is that through this conversation, what we've established is the fact that it's so important to get an early diagnosis. The medications that are available now is only with the early diagnosis, and they work. So you know what I mean. So I hope we get that out there. So
And I do want to mention real quick too.
Please.
There's medications that, even though they're not meant to cure, they can help people operate at the highest level possible. So just like cold medication doesn't necessarily stop the runny nose and the cough, but it will ease it. So some of the medications will help with the symptoms.
I understand that whole why that works, and plus that it's like if they slow the progression of that, okay, in any way possible, and knowing that, I think you can do a lot more for yourself. The family can do a lot more for you than in the advanced stages. By then, it's really too late.
Yeah.
Okay, so it is important to secure the diagnosis. Where would you go? Where would you go to find out, do I have this or don't I?
So I would start with primary physician, but usually a good primary physician is probably going to refer someone to a neurologist. So.
Okay, that's interesting. When I was 30 years ago, okay, when I was in college, well, it wasn't actually that long ago, okay, it used to, like, we would talk about Alzheimer's, but nobody ever knew because they needed, obviously, the brain to be autopsied to have that diagnosis secure, okay, but is there anything now that they can look at where they can tell without having to autopsy your brain?
Medicine has come so far.
It has, hasn't it?
There are lots of different things that they can do. There are blood tests, there are imaging tests that they can do on the brain, there are psychological testing that they do, neurocognitive testing that they do, to where they don't have to be so invasive.
That's good to know, isn't it? Okay, so anyway, one of the big challenges we talked about is caregiving, okay? So it's obviously just awful to get this diagnosis. I mean, I can't imagine hearing anything worse. But we're going to talk a little bit about the family, and you saying it was a family disease and adult children, or it's everybody's disease. So let's talk a little bit about that, and then let's talk a little bit about memory care, like the stuff that's going on at the village.
Okay. So it definitely is a family disease, and one of the reasons we're here today is that we will be, Gabby will be starting in conjunction with Alzheimer's Association, a support group at the village of Westland.
Yay!
So very excited on that. I can share as a former caregiver that a support group was what was most beneficial to me. Being able to talk to other people going through a similar situation, and then people would offer advice and help, and you can pull from them and just unload in a safe environment. And the other thing that happens is that eventually you mentor other people, which gives us a sense of purpose through this devastating disease. But that was what worked for me best. But what I see happen more often than not is the caregiver keeps putting themselves on the back burner. I made sure I got my parents to every single one of their doctor's appointments, and I missed about 3 during the time for myself during that same time period.
I get it.
Yep.
Yeah, me too. So it's really important that caregivers actually learn from the people who have been doing this for a while, because they can give you a tremendous amount of good advice.
Yep.
It's not one of those live and learn. It's like you can learn from somebody else's struggles. So that's really great, I think. And plus that, like you said, you can't unload with parents. Okay, you're frustrated and you say, wow, I just don't feel like I have a life, blah, blah, blah. And so you love your parent. It's not like you do anything else, but it's a burden. It's not a burden that you don't take out of love. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
So yeah, for sure. The brain does typically shrink, okay, as people get older, but we don't see the devastating loss of neurons in other diseases like we do in Alzheimer's. So I think this isn't just dementia. It's like when you know that eventually it's fatal, you're looking at something entirely different than just a cognitive decline, Okay, with Alzheimer's disease, okay, so it's more widespread than other dementias. There are ways that they can look at it, that you can go to a neurologist, they can do cognitive testing, they can do other things that now will alert them to the fact that there's a big problem. Okay, so I've not read a lot about that in recent years, but I don't generally do work with people with dementia. I mean, slight dementia, yes, but once it progresses to, they normally don't come and socialize at the center. But let's talk about the village of Westland. Let's talk about memory care there. So do you actually take people who have Alzheimer's?
Yes, we have we have assisted living and memory care, which we're merging into both memory care, and we have a lot of different options for them when it comes to interaction during the day. We have activities that are specific for people with dementias and Alzheimer's to help with that brain boosting and that memory support. We have the caregivers that are there 24/7 to help with anything that they may need. It's a secure facility, so that way that elopement and wandering risk is declined, and it's a smaller facility. So both Rose Cottage and Ivy Cottage have about 20 single beds or single rooms in them, and so it's not like a nursing home where it's 2 to a room, very hectic with 60 people with a 10-to-1 staff ratio. The ratios are very good.
Well, Gabby, earlier on, and you and I talked about really the things about proteins and all of that stuff. Let's talk a little bit about science and biology for a second. Okay.
I was a biology major for a semester, so I feel like
I knew that. I could tell. So what about the proteins and everything, or how the brain lacks the ability to function, the
Yeah.
biological.
Yeah, so there's a couple different things that go on. So we talked about earlier the breakdown of the neurons, of the nucleus, the dendrites, and the axon. So the axon is that the nucleus is here, this little round ball. Then there's the pole of the axon and like the little fingers of the dendrites. That's how I remember
I
it.
think of a little octopus.
Right. And so those dendrites communicate with each other by being close to each other and sending an electronic signal between each other. So there are two different proteins. There's one that's a beta protein in the brain that blocks that signal around, that creates around the neuron to where it can't send that signal to the next one because there's something blocking it. And then there's another protein that's inside the neuron that's called the tau that keeps it from going out because that protein is on the inside of the neuron, and so it blocks it from internally.
So when they can't communicate anymore, they die.
They die off, yes.
Okay, and so if this is widespread in the brain, it doesn't take any
Right.
genius to figure out, wow, it's completely detrimental.
And that's why it's very important to get early imaging, because you can see the progression of it, of those dark spots in the brain, because those electronic signals aren't showing anymore. And so you can see what areas of the brain are affected in those imaging to see what types of dementia there are.
Well, that's great to know. I want to thank you both for being here, Roger and Gabby,
Thank
to
you.
give us
It's our
a
pleasure.
little insight, you know what I mean, about what Alzheimer's is, why it's so important to get an early diagnosis, that there are new things happening, and hope that there's a cure for the future.
Yes, thanks for having
Thank
us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And thank you to our viewing audience who was with us today. I'm Barbara Marcum. This is Friendship Focus.